Thank you, Chairman. Here we are, $107 billion of the $3.5 trillion. And when you drill down into it, there's $2.5 billion for the so-called community violence intervention initiatives. And I'm concerned that these so-called intervention initiatives are going to include funding for extreme risk protection orders, which are also called red flags. Last year, our committee considered a bill that would deprive law-abiding Americans of their due process rights while taking away their Second Amendment rights. It would have paid states or tribes to enact a law that allowed anyone to petition a court to apply for an extreme risk protection order to be issued to take away an individual's firearms. The federal government should not be in the business of bribing states to adopt unconstitutional laws. Yet I'm afraid that's what this legislation today, the spending bill, is going to do. In fact, 17 states have already adopted some form of red flag laws, and there's no evidence that these laws have reduced the frequency of shootings. In fact, these laws authorize unannounced gun confiscations that are hazardous to both citizens and law enforcement officers. For instance, a man in Maryland was shot in the confusion that ensued when his house was raided in the dark. And it's because of dangers like this that you have some sheriffs who are already saying they will not enforce these red flag laws because they present a danger to their deputies. The criteria for red flagging a person in the various states are already vague, and it's vague in the federal statute that's been proposed. In some of the states, the people that can request a red flag are police officers, family members, romantic partners, and cohabitants. But anybody can call a police officer and refer it, so basically anybody can ask for a red flag on somebody. The system is ripe for abuse. Every state in the union already has a law that allows individuals to be involuntarily confined to a medical facility briefly on the basis of a mental health professional's opinion that they are a danger to themselves or others. Whereas these laws, these red flag laws, whereas those laws treat individuals in need, the red flag laws only irritate individuals by taking some of their firearms and leaving them without mental health help. Furthermore, red flag laws don't require expert testimony of a medical health professional. Despite the sacrifices, the evidence shows no benefits from red flag laws, the sacrifices of their constitutional rights. Looking at the data from 1970 through 2017, these laws had no significant effect on murder, suicide, mass public shooting, fatalities, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary. These laws do not save lives. In fact, they endanger lives in another way. If somebody knows that they seek mental health help because they might be a danger, or they feel they might be a danger to themselves or somebody else, if they know if they seek that help, then that could get them flagged, and then they would lose their constitutional rights. They may not go seek that help. And so they're dangerous. These red flag laws are dangerous for that reason. We've already got a situation at the VA where veterans are banned from owning or possessing firearms or even ammunition if they merely admit that somebody else administers their finances. This is not due process. This is not constitutional. And that's why we need this amendment to ensure that those rights are not abridged without due process. Getting back to the legislation that was passed in this committee, the issuance of an ex parte extreme risk protection order would permit law enforcement to seize firearms without the respondent being afforded the right to a briefing. In fact, the firearms can be held by law enforcement for up to a month before the respondent has a chance on a hearing, and they're going to have to hire a lawyer at that point. The level that's required is reasonable cause to believe that the respondent poses a danger of causing harm to himself or others in the near future by having access to a firearm. That's a very low standard, and it would deprive individuals of their Second Amendment right. And when the petitioner is finally granted his day in court, the government only needs to prove by preponderance of the evidence that the respondent proposes a danger. Again, this is a very low standard to deprive individuals of their Second Amendment right, and we're assuming they're guilty until they can prove themselves innocent. Bear in mind, the average person is going to have to retain legal counsel, expensive legal counsel. These are not criminals. They're not illegal aliens. They're not fugitives. These are law-abiding citizens. They're not prohibited by law from purchasing a firearm or possessing them, and they should not lose their Second Amendment right without due process and with such a low evidentiary standard, and I urge adoption of this amendment.
I withdraw the point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The underlying measure directs the Attorney General to fund programs to reduce violence in our communities. And the measure does not direct funding to any particular purpose or program. I do not believe it is necessary for us to tell the Attorney General to protect due process rights with respect to any of the programs that are funded, because I expect the Attorney General would do so without any direction from us. I believe this amendment is not necessary, and I oppose its adoption. I yield back. Who seeks recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, the question occurs.
Mr. Biggs, I think.
Mr. Biggs, do you seek recognition?
I do seek recognition, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
With a strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massie.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. I would like a chance to rebut the chairman's contention that this isn't a necessary amendment. Well, it shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately it is necessary because we've seen these kinds of abuses already at the Veterans Administration, where veterans, if they when they're being asked, when they apply for benefits that they have earned that they deserve, disability benefits related to serving this country, if they so much as say that they are not managing their own finances, there they have their due process rights stripped away. They're presumed guilty.
18, right?
Excuse me, somebody has a hot mic here. The veterans are presumed guilty and their rights are taken away. So we have seen due process taken away. We have seen it proposed in the bills already that have passed out of this committee. The evidentiary standards are so low, reasonable suspicion, preponderance of the evidence, to remove their Second Amendment rights in the bills that have been proposed in this very committee, that we are talking about red flag laws that would deprive them of the right to keep and bear arms without due process. We cannot trust the Attorney General. And frankly, I'm just going to say, we can't trust a Republican Attorney General or a Democratic Attorney General to follow the due process laws, the rich 250-year history of our country, unless we codify this, put this in the statute. Look, you may think the money's not going to go there, but who would have ever imagined that money would go to a Chinese lab to fund development of a virus that would be unleashed on the public and cause so much pain and suffering? People want to blame Dr. Fauci for that, but I blame Congress for funding it. And let's don't make those mistakes again. Let's don't have hearings later after somebody's rights have been abridged and say, well, why did Congress fund these programs? Let's stop it right here. Let's fence it in and let's say you will not use this money to deprive somebody of due process. I don't care if you're a Republican Attorney General or a Democrat Attorney General. You do not get the money to do that. We have the power of the purse. This is $3.5 trillion. We're entrusted with, in this Judiciary Committee, with $107 billion of that, and $2.5 billion of it is going to very vague programs. But we know what that's going to end up funding if we don't put these fences on that. And so I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back to my good friend Andy Biggs from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to just cover one quick thing, and then before I yield to the gentleman from Ohio. So in this section on page 18, we're not seeing any definition of these community-based violence intervention initiatives. There's a few in there listed for funding, but otherwise it is wide open. And when you don't have a definition like that, and Congress chooses not to provide very specific definitions in this case, that means the Attorney General might read it and say, well, yeah, we do want to have some red flag law programs. That would be a huge problem. That's why this amendment is so necessary, because the underlying bill, which I have mentioned repeatedly today, does not adequately provide definitions and guidance. And with that, I'll yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to support the gentleman from Kentucky's amendment. It's a good amendment. I think we started today's markup by talking about, at least those of us on the Republican side, talking about this committee is supposed to be the committee most focused in the United States Congress on protecting the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the fundamental liberties the American people enjoy. And we're talking about the Second Amendment. I always say the Second Amendment's right next to the first because it's pretty darn important. This is a good amendment focused on the thing that we should be as a committee focused on. I hope the committee will adopt this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back as well.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Last word.
And ladies recognized.
I want to share with my good friends and the gentleman from Kentucky I know has always been a strong advocate for constitutional rights and the rights to privacy, and I respect that. But both the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment codify protections, I think, that will be evident. They are codified. 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process. Fifth Amendment, due process. But I think as relates to the idea of what this community intervention dollars will be able to be utilized for, these are well-known and conspicuous programs in the Office of Justice Programs, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, Office of Violence Against Women, which will include among those the concern about juveniles and violence in that age group. And as well, we'll look to all aspects of our society, urban and rural. And I believe the fact that this is in the discretion of the Attorney General, the Attorney General cannot violate, nor can the programs that he provides these discretionary funds to, in his discretion, due process. And so all we have to do is look to the Constitution. I think the amendment is well intended, but I oppose the amendment because I believe we do have the protection necessary. And these programs are simply to do what we are trying to enact, is to intervene in community violence and to ensure a safe community for our urban and rural citizens of this country. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate the chairman. I appreciate the amendment being offered from my friend from Kentucky. It's an important amendment. I obviously support it. And I think in response to the gentlelady from Texas, who earlier, by the way, and I take it in good faith, accused me of being political. Well, and then I might go run an ad. Well, first of all, I don't think I can run an ad from these official proceedings. But second of all, yeah, it's political. You're darn right it's political. You got people in Texas who are getting hurt on policies being proposed by my Democrat colleagues. So you're darn right I'm raising issues that I know that my constituents are concerned about. One of those issues is ensuring that they can maintain and preserve and protect their Second Amendment rights. It is the great separator of this country from others in terms of the right balance between the people and the power of government. It is the great equalizer. And the American people know that. The Texans know that. I want my Second Amendment rights because my Democratic colleagues want my streets to be less safe by defunding police. I want my Second Amendment rights because my borders are wide open and being run by cartels while dangerous individuals pour across the border. I want my Second Amendment rights because, like the ranchers I talked to last week, having their wires cut and having illegal immigrants come up to their houses and endanger their families and loved ones, I want my family and my loved ones to be able to arm themselves, to protect themselves, due to the rote incompetence of Democrats who don't seem to care about our safety and well-being, only to have the government tell us how we're supposed to live. I want the Second Amendment to be able to maintain my rights. That's why I want the Second Amendment. The gentlelady from Texas gave up the game earlier when we were talking about my friend from North Carolina's amendment to ensure that we don't encourage cities to continue these foolish policies of defunding the police. When she said that you don't need to do that, and talked about these great programs that target guns, right? Focusing on the guns. I'm old enough to remember when we targeted the criminals who misuse guns and had a precipitous decline in violent crime. Now I see the opposite. See an administration that nominates a radical leftist like Chipman, who even this administration, even in this Congress, had to withdraw his nomination because he's such a radical, gun-grabbing leftist. My friend from Kentucky is right to ensure that we put forward an amendment to guarantee we preserve and protect the Second Amendment of the United States, to ensure that we preserve and protect the ability for us to maintain weapons to defend ourselves against the long arm of government, against the criminals that government is allowing to roam on the streets, against the criminals, the lawlessness, the cartels that they're allowing to roam into our state in Texas due to a complete and total failure to secure the border of the United States, as is their charge. The gentleman from Kentucky is well versed in knowing the abuse of so-called red flag laws and other nice sounding policies that are thrown into things like community policing and community programs. But these are not the kinds of programs that are designed to target getting criminals off the streets who are misusing those weapons, as much as they are creating an environment which will continue to foster the lawlessness on our streets and foster the targeting of the ability of law-abiding citizens to be able to maintain those weapons. We've already seen the ATF under this administration targeting our ability to have access to maintain the weapons that we believe are important and critical for the safety and well-being of our communities and our states. They've done so and are engaged in doing that as we speak. And thankfully, there's organizations standing up for the rights and liberties of all Americans, trying to fight to preserve and protect those in the face of a government that would prefer to eliminate those rights, reduce those rights, minimize those rights, those very rights that separate us and make sure that we are able to protect this American ideal for our kids and our grandkids.
Will the
So
gentleman yield?
I do. 20 seconds.
Well, the gentlelady from Texas and the chairman and everybody else here, we all agree we need due process. I think what we're missing, though, is due process involves confronting your accuser. It involves innocent until proven guilty. It involves a trial by jury. It involves an evidentiary standard that's high. And all of those things are missing from red flag laws, and that's why I've offered this amendment and urge its adoption.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anybody else on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Gates of Florida.
Mr. Gates, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Massie Amendment ripens a very important point. As the Taliban run through Afghanistan with tons of U.S.-made weapons on the streets everywhere, the Build Back Better Biden program in America actually includes a soft gun control. And the way that that is intended to be executed is through $2.5 billion of federal money dangled over the heads of your local communities with the hopes that they will adopt federal standards on a variety of policing issues. And with these red flag laws all the rage and fully embraced by the Biden administration, that might be just the beginning of the soft gun control that creeps into our communities as a consequence of the Build Back Better program. I think that our fellow Americans would be right to be skeptical of an argument that starts by saying we're for community policing, and the best way to achieve it is a federal program run out of Washington, D.C., administered out of Washington, D.C. If anything, the true meaning of community policing would be resilient communities and sustainable communities that fund their own law enforcement, and then that law enforcement is resourced out of a community, connected to that community, and able to reflect the values of that community. And when we centralize the funding of law enforcement at the Department of Justice, then sometimes we centralize the thinking. And I think Mr. Massie is correct to be concerned that the thinking of this administration is out of touch with communities in Kentucky and Texas and certainly in North Florida where I live. For example, in my community, someone like David Chipman would be seen as a radical, someone who opposes banning the AR-15, which is functionally the flagship rifle of the Second Amendment. You know, in my community, folks use the AR-15 to hunt hogs sometimes. I know there are many Americans who use that rifle for personal security and to secure their families. And so with an administration that seems to embrace these values that are not shared in my community and in many others, I would suggest that the provisions of this reconciliation legislation that empower the Department of Justice to have more leverage over our communities will mean that the policing is less reflective of the people that are directly receiving the provision of that service and more reflective of the thinking of the Biden administration, and that ought to concern many. And so with this vote, we'll sort of see who endorses gun control in America as a feature of Build Back Better, and those of us who think that that's not a proper objective for the Department of Justice. And I would yield any time to the gentleman from Kentucky that he might choose to consume.
Well, thank you. I think this vote is, by the way, that was very well stated. We don't want Washington, D.C. in charge of community programs. It's an oxymoron, and the gentleman is right to point out that every community is different. But I think this vote that we're about to have is not really a referendum on gun control so much as it is on due process. I mean, it's not so much a referendum on the Biden administration as it is on any administration who might seek to subvert due process or encourage states and communities to take shortcuts and not follow due process, which would be in violation of the Constitution. So that's what, to me, this vote is about. Yes, it's about gun control, but more specifically, it is about due process. Do you believe that the 250-year history we have of allowing people to be innocent until they were proven guilty, to have their day in court, do you believe in that? If you do, then vote for this amendment. And I'll yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
And I would yield back to the chair.
The question occurs on the amendment.
I'd like to be heard. This is Gomert.
Gentleman is recognized.
Like the last word, yeah, I rise in support of the amendment. And I can understand a Democrat friend from Texas. I mean, I was just like her. I was thinking, you know, especially the VA, what are they going to do to hurt somebody's constitutional Second Amendment rights? And then we would start having people say they went to the VA for a checkup and they didn't think anything about it. Were asked, you know, who pays the bills in your family? And, you know, some of us have very smart spouses or wives. And, you know, like in my case, she got her MBA in accounting. I'm not here when a lot of bills have to be paid. And if I were asked, I would think that was pretty innocuous question. Okay, yeah, my wife pays more of the bills than I do, not realizing that that would be used without due process at all. No due process. It goes in the charts as the man can't take care of his own records. He says his wife does, and therefore he gets red flagged and can't buy a weapon, can't buy a firearm. A Second Amendment right is taken away without any due process. And like I said, I'm like my friend from Texas, I would never have thought that was the case until it started happening repeatedly. And so the only thing I disagreed with my friend from Kentucky about was when he said, you know, it's an oxymoron to have the federal government in charge of community programs. I disagree there. I don't think it's an oxymoron. I think it's just simply moronic. They're just moronic. We shouldn't have the federal government in charge of community programs, especially when it comes to something like this, and especially when we already have bedrock examples from the Biden-Obama administration of exactly what they'll do. Now we have it from Biden himself. they are out to take away Americans' Second Amendment rights. And this is a great place to have a Second Amendment protection because, for heaven's sake, the amendment will prevent this administration from continuing to disregard the Supreme Court, disregard the law of the land, and try to take people's firearms away from them so they cannot self-protect. And with that, unless the gentleman from Kentucky needs time, then I yield back.
Gentlemen.